In a dusty Colorado saloon, a crippled widow trying to sell her late husband's pocket watch is cruelly mocked by three young men. Everyone turns away until a feared gunslinger in a weathered duster walks through those swinging doors. He steps between her and her tormentors, only to be falsely accused of threatening violence. But when the sheriff arrives, a shocking truth comes to light that stuns the entire town. The gunslinger is no ordinary drifter, and those three young men are about to learn a lesson they'll never forget. Before we begin, drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? The late August sun hammered down on Dustridge, Colorado territory, turning the dirt streets into ribbons of pale dust that clung to boots and wagon wheels alike. The Silver Spur Saloon sat at the corner of Main Street, its painted sign faded by years of wind and weather, the swinging doors creaking softly in the dry breeze. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of whiskey, tobacco smoke, and sweat. Men gathered around poker tables, their voices low and rough, while the bartender wiped down glasses with a rag that had seen better days. Sarah Mae Thornton pushed through those swinging doors with her shoulder, her wooden crutch striking the floorboards in a rhythm she'd grown used to over the past 2 years. The sound echoed briefly before being swallowed by the hum of conversation and the clink of glass on wood. She wore a simple black dress, still in mourning for her husband Thomas, who had been crushed in a cave-in at the silver mine just outside town. The same accident had shattered her left leg, leaving her dependent on the crutch that now bore the weight of her small frame. She made her way toward the bar, her eyes fixed ahead, trying not to notice the way conversations paused as she passed. It wasn't the first time she'd felt the weight of their stares. A woman alone, a widow, crippled. She was a reminder of things men in this town preferred not to think about. Mortality, fragility, the cost of ambition in a place built on silver and stone. In her hand, wrapped carefully in a handkerchief, was her husband's gold pocket watch. It was the last thing of value she owned, and she'd come to sell it to Ezra Pike, the saloon owner, who sometimes bought items from folks down on their luck. She needed the money, the rent was overdue, and winter wasn't far off. She reached the bar and set the watch gently on the counter. Ezra glanced at it, then at her, his expression softening just slightly. "Sarah Mae," he said quietly, his voice respectful. "You sure about this?" She nodded. "I'm sure." Before he could respond, a voice cut through the room from the back corner, loud, mocking. "Well, would you look at that, boys?" came the drawl of Bo Hutchins, a young man in his early 20s with slicked-back hair and a smirk that seemed permanently etched on his face. He leaned back in his chair, boots propped up on the table, a half-empty glass of whiskey in his hand. The crippled widows come to beg for scraps. His two friends, Colt Brennan and Wade Pritchard, snickered from across the table. Colt, broad-shouldered and red-faced from drink, nudged Wade with his elbow. "Bet she's got some sob story ready to go," he said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Wade stood up, grinning, and began to exaggerate a limp across the floor, dragging his left leg behind him in a cruel parody of Sarah's gait. "Oh, please, Mr. Pike," he whined in a high-pitched voice. "I'm just a poor, helpless woman." "Won't someone take pity on me?" Laughter erupted from their table, sharp and ugly. A few men at the bar glanced over, their faces tight with discomfort, but no one said a word. A card player near the window shifted in his seat and looked down at his hand. Another man took a long drink from his glass and stared at the wall. Sarah felt the heat rise in her chest, her fingers tightening around the edge of the bar. She didn't turn around. She didn't give them the satisfaction. But her throat tightened, and her breath came shallow and quick. She'd heard it before, different words, same venom. The world had little patience for women like her. Ezra's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The room had gone quieter now, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful but tense, waiting. Everyone heard it. No one moved. And then the swinging doors creaked open. The sound of boots on the wooden floor was slow and deliberate, each step measured and heavy, the kind of sound that made men look up from their cards, that made conversations die mid-sentence. A figure stepped through the swinging doors of the Silver Spur, and the light from outside cast him in silhouette for a moment, before he moved fully into the dim interior of the saloon. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, wearing a long duster coat that hung past his knees, dust-covered and worn from long miles on the trail. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but beneath it, a thick beard streaked with gray framed a jaw set hard as iron. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster tied down in the way that told any man with sense that this wasn't decoration. It was a tool, and he knew how to use it. Jacob Callahan didn't say a word as he stepped inside. His eyes, pale and sharp, swept the room with the kind of awareness that came from years of watching for trouble before it announced itself. He took in the bar, the tables, the faces turned toward him with a mix of curiosity and caution. And then his gaze found Sarah Mae Thornton, standing alone at the bar, her shoulders drawn in tight, her knuckles white against the wooden crutch. He saw the three young men in the back corner, saw the way Wade Pritchard was still half bent in his mocking limp, frozen now under the weight of Jake's stare, saw the smug grin on Bo Hutchins' face falter just slightly, saw Colt Brennan's hand hover near his glass, uncertain whether to drink or set it down. Jake's boots struck the floor again, slow and steady, as he crossed the room. He didn't go to the bar. He didn't order a drink. He walked straight to Sarah Mae and stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the presence of someone standing with her, not over her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice low and rough like gravel underfoot. He tipped his hat to her, a gesture of respect that felt almost foreign in a room that had offered her none. Sarah looked up at him, startled. She didn't know this man, didn't recognize the face beneath the hat. But there was something in his eyes, steady, calm, and without pity, that made her feel, for the first time since she'd walked in, like she wasn't alone. Jake turned then, his gaze shifting to the three young men in the corner. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "You boys got something to say?" he asked evenly. "Or are you done making fools of yourselves?" Bo Hutchins straightened in his chair, his smirk returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" he shot back, his tone laced with false bravado. "Some drifter looking to play hero?" Wade, emboldened by Bo's words, let out a sharp laugh. "Maybe he's her husband come back from the grave," he sneered, gesturing toward Sarah, "come to defend her honor or some such nonsense." Colt leaned forward, his voice thick with drink. "This ain't your business, mister. Best you move along before you find yourself in trouble you can't walk away from." Jake didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his hands loose at his sides, his posture relaxed but ready. There was no anger in his expression, no flash of rage, just a quiet, unyielding presence that filled the space, like a storm gathering on the horizon. "I'm making it my business," Jake said, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of finality. "And I'm giving you one chance to apologize to the lady and walk out of here with what's left of your dignity." The room had gone completely silent now. Even the bartender had stopped wiping glasses. Every eye was on the standoff unfolding in the center of the saloon. Bo Hutchins' face darkened. His hand drifted toward his belt, not to a gun, but to his coat pocket. "You threatening us?" Bo said, his voice rising. "Because that sounds like a threat to me." Jake Callahan's expression didn't change. He simply stood there, solid as a mountain, his eyes never leaving Bo Hutchins' face. "I'm not threatening you, son," he said evenly. "I'm telling you how this ends if you've got the sense God gave a mule. You apologize, you leave, and we all forget this happened." Bo's face flushed red, a mixture of embarrassment and anger. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially not in front of his friends, not in front of a room full of witnesses. His father owned half the cattle that moved through Dustridge, and that had always been enough to insulate him from consequences. He glanced at Colt and Wade, both of whom were watching him, waiting to see what he'd do. "I don't take orders from saddle tramps," Bo spat, pushing back from the table and rising to his feet. His hand went into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper, a telegram. He waved it in the air like a badge. "My father's got connections all the way to Denver. The law in this town answers to people like me, not drifters like you." Wade stood as well, emboldened by Bo's defiance. "Yeah," he added, his voice louder now. "You think you can just walk in here and tell us what to do? You don't know who you're dealing with." Colt rose last, his hand resting on the back of his chair. "We could have you thrown in jail for this," he said, his words slurred slightly from drink. "Threatening upstanding citizens." "That's a crime, ain't it?" Jake's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "The only crime I see here is 3 grown men mocking a woman who's done nothing but try to survive." Bo sneered and turned toward the bar. "Ezra," he shouted, "you got a runner who can fetch the sheriff? I want this man arrested. Now." Ezra Pike, the saloon owner, stood behind the bar with his arms crossed, his face drawn tight. He looked from Bo to Jake, then to Sarah May, who stood silent and still, her eyes fixed on the floor. For a moment, it seemed like he might refuse, but Bo's father had money, and money had a way of making decisions for people. "I'll send someone," Ezra said quietly, nodding to one of the younger men near the door. The boy darted out into the street, his boots kicking up dust as he ran toward the sheriff's office. Bo turned back to Jake, his smirk returning in full force. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, friend." Jake didn't respond. He simply turned back to Sarah May, his voice softening. "You all right, ma'am?" Sarah looked up at him, her eyes glistening, but her voice steady. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. "They'll twist it." "They always do." "I know," Jake replied, "but I'm still here." The minutes stretched long and tense. The saloon had become a theater, and everyone inside was an unwilling audience. Men shifted in their seats, pretending to return to their drinks or their cards, but no one was really paying attention to anything except the man in the duster and the 3 young men who were now pacing near their table, whispering to each other in low, conspiratorial tones. Outside, the sound of boots on the boardwalk grew louder. The door swung open, and Sheriff Clayton Morris stepped inside, his silver star catching the light from the window. He was a man in his 50s, lean and weathered, with a face that had seen too many fights and too few easy days. Behind him came Deputy Tom Rivers, younger and less certain, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. The sheriff's eyes scanned the room, landing first on Bo, then on Jake. His expression was hard to read, but there was a flicker of something, recognition maybe or surprise, that passed across his face before he schooled it back into neutrality. "All right," Sheriff Morris said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Someone want to tell me what in the hell is going on here?" Bo, Hutchins wasted no time. He stepped forward, his chest puffed out, his voice loud and indignant. "Sheriff, thank God you're here. This man," he jabbed a finger toward Jake, "came in here and started threatening us. We were just minding our own business, having a drink, and he walks in like he owns the place and starts making all kinds of accusations." Wade nodded eagerly, stepping up beside Bo. "That's right, Sheriff. He said he'd make us regret it if we didn't do what he said. Sounded like a threat to me." Colt chimed in, his voice slurred but confident. "We got witnesses, too." Whole room heard it. "He's dangerous, Sheriff. You can see it just by looking at him." Sheriff Morris's eyes shifted to Jake, taking in the duster, the gun belt, the weathered face beneath the wide-brimmed hat. His expression remained unreadable, but his hand drifted toward his own sidearm, a precautionary gesture. Deputy Rivers stepped to the side, his young face tense, clearly ready to back whatever play the sheriff made. "That true?" Morris asked, his voice flat. "You threatened these boys?" Jake stood perfectly still, his hands resting easy at his sides, nowhere near his gun. His voice was calm, measured, carrying the weight of a man who had nothing to hide. I told them to apologize to the lady for mocking her. I told them they could leave with their dignity intact if they had the sense to do it. That's all I said. Bo scoffed. He's lying, Sheriff. He came in here looking for trouble, and now he's trying to talk his way out of it. Sarah May's voice cut through the room, quiet but clear. That's not what happened. All eyes turned to her. She stood straighter now, her grip firm on her crutch, her chin lifted. They were mocking me, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it, making fun of the way I walk, laughing at me because I came here to sell my husband's watch. She paused, her eyes moving to Bo. This man didn't threaten anyone. He just asked them to stop. Bo's face twisted with anger. Oh, so now the cripple's his witness? She'd say anything to... Watch your mouth, boy, Sheriff Morris said sharply, his tone cold enough to cut. Bo snapped his jaw shut, but his eyes burned with resentment. The sheriff turned his attention back to Jake, studying him more closely now. The lines around his eyes deepened, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of recognition that he couldn't quite hide. His gaze moved from Jake's face to the gun belt, then back up again. You got a name, stranger? Morris asked, his voice quieter now, almost cautious. Jake met his eyes without flinching. Jacob Callahan. The room seemed to hold its breath. The name hung in the air like smoke, settling slowly over the space. Sheriff Morris went very still. Deputy Rivers glanced at his superior, confusion plain on his face. Jacob Callahan, Morris repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the words. His hand dropped away from his sidearm. Jake Callahan, former U.S. Marshal out of Wyoming Territory. Jake nodded once. That's right. The deputy's eyes widened. The Jake Callahan? The one who brought in the Dawson gang? Who tracked down Black Jim Tolliver after he... That's enough, Tom, Morris said quietly, though his tone carried a note of respect now. He took a step closer to Jake, his posture shifting from confrontation to something closer to deference. Didn't know you were back in Dustridge, Marshal, or should I say, Judge Callahan now. A murmur rippled through the saloon. Men exchanged glances. The card players set down their hands. Even Ezra Pike leaned forward against the bar, his expression shifting from discomfort to surprise. Bo's smirk faltered. Judge, he said, his voice losing some of its edge. What's he talking about? Sheriff Morris turned to face the three young men, his expression hardening. This man, he said slowly, is Judge Jacob Callahan, brother to Mayor Callahan, son of the Callahans who own the largest ranch in the territory and funded the building of the church, the schoolhouse, and half the roads you ride on. The color drained from Bo's face. The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. Bo Hutchins stood frozen, his mouth half open. The smugness drained from his face like water from a cracked basin. Wade and Colt exchanged panicked glances, their earlier bravado evaporating under the weight of the sheriff's words. Sheriff Morris continued, his voice carrying through the saloon with the authority of a man who had seen too many situations like this go wrong. Judge Callahan here rides circuit through 5 territories. He's presided over more trials than most men see in a lifetime. And before that, he wore a marshal's badge and brought law to places that didn't want it. Deputy Rivers looked at Jake with something close to awe, his hand now well away from his revolver. I heard stories about you, sir, he said quietly. Didn't know they were true. Jake's expression remained unchanged, his voice steady and without pride. Stories get bigger in the telling, Deputy. I'm just a man who did his job, but the room didn't see it that way. The men at the poker table sat straighter. The ones at the bar turned fully around to get a better look. Whispers began to spread like wildfire through dry grass. Even Ezra Pike, who had seen just about everything in his years running the Silver Spur, looked at Jake with newfound respect. Bo tried to recover, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. That doesn't change what happened here, Sheriff. He's still what? Morris interrupted, his tone sharp. Defended a woman who was being humiliated in a public establishment? Asked you to show some basic human decency? He stepped closer to Bo, his eyes hard. You want to tell me again how that's a crime? Wade's voice was small now, defensive. We were just having a little fun, Sheriff. We didn't mean anything by it. Fun, Sarah May said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. She stepped forward, her crutch striking the floor with purpose. You call mocking a widow trying to survive fun? You call imitating the way I walk because my leg was crushed in the same accident that killed my husband fun? Her voice trembled, but not with weakness, with anger, with pain held back for too long. I came here with the last thing of value I own, trying to keep a roof over my head, and you three made sport of it like I was nothing, like I was less than human. The room had gone deathly quiet. Several men looked down at their drinks, shame creeping into their faces. They had heard the mockery, they had seen Wade's cruel imitation, and they had done nothing. Sheriff Morris turned back to Bo, his jaw set. You got anything to say to that, boy? Bo's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. His face had gone from pale to flushed, a deep red creeping up his neck. Jake stepped forward then, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that made every man in the room listen. Sheriff, I'd like to make a formal complaint. I witnessed these three men engage in public harassment and humiliation of Mrs. Thornton. I heard their words, I saw their actions, and I'm willing to testify to it. Morris nodded slowly. I'll need statements from witnesses. Ezra, you see what happened? Ezra Pike cleared his throat, glancing briefly at Bo before answering. I did, Sheriff. Every word of it. It was shameful. One by one, other men in the saloon began to nod. A rancher near the window spoke up. I saw it too, Sheriff. Wasn't right. Another voice from the back. Same here. They were out of line. Now that Jake's identity was known, now that his name carried weight, suddenly everyone had seen it. Suddenly everyone was willing to speak up. Jake noticed. His jaw tightened slightly, but he said nothing. Sheriff Morris pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket. All right then. Bo Hutchins, Wade Pritchard, Colt Brennan, you three are coming with me down to the office. We're going to have a conversation about respect and consequences. Bo's voice was desperate now. My father, your father, Morris said coldly, doesn't run this town, and he sure as hell doesn't decide what's right and wrong. The three young men were escorted out of the Silver Spur with far less swagger than they'd carried in. Bo walked stiffly, his face a mask of barely contained fury and humiliation. Wade kept his eyes on the ground, his earlier confidence shattered. Colt stumbled slightly as he stepped through the swinging doors. Whether from drink or shame, it was hard to tell. Deputy Rivers followed close behind them, his hand resting on his gun belt, now more out of formality than necessity. The fight had gone out of them, the moment Jake's name had been spoken, the moment the room had turned against them. Sheriff Morris paused at the doorway, turning back to face Jake. I'll need you to come by the office later, Judge Callahan. Get your statement on record. Jake nodded. I'll be there within the hour, Clayton. The use of the sheriff's first name wasn't lost on anyone. These were men who knew each other, who had history. The kind of history that didn't need to be explained, but was understood by the way they spoke, the way they carried themselves around one another. Morris tipped his hat to Sarah May. Ma'am, I apologize that it took this long for someone to do right by you. You come by the office too when you're ready. We'll make sure this is handled properly. Sarah nodded, her voice quiet. Thank you, Sheriff. And then they were gone, the doors swinging shut behind them, leaving the saloon in a strange, heavy silence. For a long moment, no one moved. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air like dust settling after a storm. Then, slowly, the room began to exhale. Men turned back to their tables. Conversations resumed in low murmurs, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a tension now, an unspoken awareness that something had shifted, that the room had been tested and found wanting. Ezra Pike moved from behind the bar, approaching Sarah May with an expression that carried the weight of regret. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, his voice low, "I should have spoken up sooner. Should have told those boys to get out the moment they started in on you. I'm sorry." Sarah looked at him, her eyes tired but clear. "You're not the only one who stayed quiet, Mr. Pike." Ezra nodded, glancing around the room. "No, ma'am, I'm not. But that doesn't make it right." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch, counted out several bills, and placed them on the bar beside the pocket watch. "This is more than fair price for the watch, and your money's no good here anymore. Meals on the house anytime you come in." Sarah stared at the bills, then at Ezra. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," Ezra said firmly, "but I'm going to." Jake stepped forward then, his presence still commanding even in the quieter moment. He looked down at Sarah May, his expression softer now, though still serious. "You all right, ma'am?" Sarah met his eyes, and for the first time since the whole ordeal had started, she felt the tightness in her chest begin to ease. "I am now," she said quietly. "Thank you. You didn't have to stand up for me." Jake's voice was low, meant only for her. "I did, though, because I know what it's like to be judged before you even open your mouth. I know what it's like when people decide who you are based on what they see, not who you are." He paused, glancing briefly around the room, before returning his gaze to her. "And I know what it means when people finally decide to do the right thing, but only after they find out your name carries weight." Sarah heard the edge in his words, the quiet bitterness beneath the calm. She understood what he wasn't saying aloud, that if he'd been just another drifter, if his last name hadn't been Callahan, if he hadn't been a judge and a former marshal, the outcome might have been very different. "Would they have listened, she asked softly, "if you were just someone else?" Jake's jaw tightened. He didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, "I don't know. But I think we both know what the likely answer is." The truth of it settled between them like a stone dropped into still water. 2 days later, the town hall of Dustridge was fuller than it had been in months. Word had spread fast, faster than wildfire across dry prairie grass. The story of what had happened at the Silver Spur had moved from the saloon to the general store, from the blacksmith shop to the church steps, whispered over fences and shared over supper tables. By the time Judge Jacob Callahan agreed to speak publicly about the incident, nearly every able-bodied person in town had found a reason to be there. They packed the wooden benches, stood along the walls, and crowded near the open windows, fanning themselves against the late summer heat. Sarah May Thornton sat in the third row, her crutch resting against the bench beside her. She wore the same black dress, but she held herself differently now. Her back was straight, her chin lifted. The people who passed her on the way in didn't look away this time. Some nodded. A few tipped their hats. One woman, a school teacher named Clara Brennan, no relation to Colt, stopped to touch her hand and whisper, "I'm glad you're here." At the front of the room, Mayor Richard Callahan, Jake's younger brother, stood at the podium. He was a man of medium build, with a clean-shaven face and a politician's polished manner, but today his expression was serious, almost somber. He cleared his throat and addressed the crowd. "Most of you know why we're here," he began. 2 days ago, something happened in this town that has forced us to take a hard look at ourselves. My brother has agreed to speak about what he witnessed, and I ask that you listen, not just with your ears, but with your conscience. He stepped aside, and Jake rose from his seat near the front. He moved to the podium with the same slow, deliberate steps he'd taken into the saloon. He wasn't wearing his duster today, just a dark vest over a clean shirt, his gun belt absent. But even without the trappings of the gunslinger or the marshal, his presence commanded the room. He placed both hands on the edges of the podium and let his gaze sweep across the crowd. When he spoke, his voice was steady, clear, and without flourish. I came into the Silver Spur 2 days ago and saw a woman being mocked by 3 young men. They imitated the way she walked. They laughed at her misfortune. They made her feel small in a room full of people who did nothing to stop it. A few heads bowed. A man near the back shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Jake continued. I stepped in. Not because I'm a hero, not because I wanted recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because I've been on the other side of that kind of cruelty. I know what it feels like to be judged by what people see rather than who you are. He paused, his eyes finding Sarah May in the crowd. She met his gaze and nodded slightly. But here's what troubles me, Jake said, his voice dropping lower, forcing the room to lean in. When those boys called the sheriff, they were confident the law would side with them. And maybe it would have, if I'd been someone else, if I hadn't been a Callahan, if I hadn't been a judge, if my family didn't own land and fund buildings and carry a name that opens doors. The room grew very still. The only sound was the creak of the wooden beams settling in the heat. So I have to ask, Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of the question like a stone, would justice have been served if I were just a drifter? If I were just another man passing through with no title, no name, no influence? Would you have stood up for Mrs. Thornton, or would you have looked the other way, the same way most of you did that day? No one answered. The silence was damning. Jake let it sit there, heavy and uncomfortable, before he spoke again. The measure of a town, of a people, is not how they treat those with power. It's how they treat those without it. And that day, Dustridge failed that test. He stepped back from the podium. The room remained silent, but it was a silence thick with shame and reflection. Jake didn't sit back down. He stood to the side of the podium, his arms crossed, watching the faces in the crowd as his words settled over them like a cold rain. Some looked down at their boots. Others stared straight ahead, jaws tight with the kind of discomfort that comes from seeing yourself clearly for the first time. A few women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, while men shifted in their seats, unable to meet the gaze of their neighbors. Mayor Callahan stepped forward again, his voice quieter now, more personal. My brother's right, he said. We failed, not just as individuals, but as a community. And the question he's asking isn't one we can ignore or brush aside. It's one we have to answer, not with words, but with how we live from this day forward. He glanced at Jake, then back at the crowd. Bo Hutchins, Wade Pritchard, and Colt Brennan have been fined and sentenced to 60 days of community service. They're banned from the Silver Spur for a year, but their punishment doesn't absolve the rest of us. We were there, we saw it, and we did nothing. A man near the front, a rancher named Tom Whitfield, stood slowly. His hat was in his hands, and his voice was rough with emotion. I was there, he said. I saw what those boys did to Mrs. Thornton, and I'm ashamed to say I didn't speak up. I told myself it wasn't my business, but that was a coward's excuse. He turned toward Sarah May. Ma'am, I'm sorry. Truly. One by one, others began to stand. A shopkeeper, a miner, a woman who ran the boarding house. Each of them offered their apologies, their voices heavy with regret. Sarah May listened, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm but guarded. She nodded to each of them, accepting their words, though something in her eyes suggested she understood the difference between apologies spoken in a crowded room and actions taken when no one was watching. When the last person sat down, Jake spoke again. Words are a start, he said, but they're only a start. The real test comes the next time someone is mocked, belittled, or cast aside. The real test is whether you'll stand up then, when there's no judge, no mayor, no crowd to hold you accountable, when it's just you and your conscience. He looked out over the room one last time. This town can be better, but it has to choose to be. With that, he stepped down from the platform and walked toward the back of the room. As he passed Sarah May's row, he paused and offered her his hand. She took it, and he helped her to her feet, steadying her as she adjusted her crutch. Together they walked toward the doors. The crowd parted for them, a path opening down the center aisle, and as they stepped out into the bright afternoon sunlight, the murmur of conversation began to rise behind them, not the idle chatter of gossip, but the low, earnest hum of people wrestling with hard truths. Outside, the air was warm and clear. Sarah May stopped on the steps of the town hall and turned to Jake. "You didn't have to do all this," she said quietly. "The speech, the questions, you could have just let it end at the saloon." Jake shook his head. "If I'd let it end there, nothing would have changed. They would have punished those boys and called it justice, and everyone else would have gone back to pretending they weren't part of the problem." Sarah studied his face for a long moment. "Do you think they'll actually change?" Jake looked out at the dusty street, at the town he'd grown up in, the town his family had helped build. "Some will," he said. "Some won't. But at least now they can't say they didn't know better." Sarah May nodded slowly. For the first time in 2 years, since the accident, since her husband's death, since the world had become a harder, lonelier place, she felt something close to hope. She adjusted her grip on the crutch and started down the steps, moving with steady determination. Jake watched her go, and as she disappeared around the corner, he allowed himself a faint, weary smile. The work wasn't finished, but it had begun. The screen fades to black, and the words appear, "True justice should never depend on a name or a title." If this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe for more powerful tales of courage and redemption. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story that matters.